to welcome to the third in the series of consultations around the Stockholm plus 50 process. I'm just waiting for a couple more people to join us. We are at 17, 18 at the moment. So if you'd bear with me, I'm just going to ask you for 2 more minutes to allow some of our colleagues who I know are on their way to joining to join this meeting. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you again for joining us for the third in the series of our discussions. Okay. All right. So, okay, I'm making a sound check. Can everybody hear me at the moment? Hear and see me?
We can hear you now.
Great.
For a bit.
Okay, thank you. Great. All righty. So we're filling up quite nicely. And I think at this stage, we are going to get started. All of our panelists are with us. And again, a warm welcome to you. So this morning, for the third in the series of the Stockholm plus 50 Barbados process, consultation process, we are looking closely at accelerating sustainable development and the decade for action. And so this morning, I'm just going to briefly remind those of us who are joining for the first time what Stockholm is about. The Stockholm Declaration was adopted on the 16th of January, 1972, by the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, it was the first document to recognize the interconnections between development, poverty, and the environment. 50 years after Stockholm, with increasing environmental challenges and growing inequality affecting development and well-being, the global community comes together to reflect on the urgent need for actions to address these interconnections. So ladies and gentlemen, again, a warm welcome to you. I'm seeing some people who have joined us now for day 3, haven't been here for the first 2 conversations, and I just wish to thank you for your presence again and looking forward eagerly to your input. This is a very important topic. And I will also at this time like to invite Mr. Mohammed Nagdi, the head of Sustainable Solutions, Energy and Climate Change Program for the United Nations Development Program for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, to just give us some welcome remarks. Mohammed, over to you.
Thanks, Donna. Good morning to everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, so welcome, as Donna would have mentioned, to the third leadership dialogue that we hope will also be as collaborative and multi-stakeholder with a focus on recommendations that contribute to the environmental dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals, and will also accelerate the implementation of commitments in the decade of action and delivery for sustainable development, and including sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So many of you would know that UN General Assembly had agreed to convene an international meeting entitled Stockholm plus 50, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity, in Stockholm on the 2nd and 3rd of June during the week of World Environment Day. So this meeting will commemorate the 50 years since the convening of the UN Conference on the Human Environment. And it is also designed to help accelerate the implementation of the SDGs during the decade of action. So the government of Sweden will host this meeting with the support of the government of Kenya, and the meeting will reinforce the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the creation of the UN Environment, so the UNEP. So Barbados is one of just 2 Caribbean islands that will be participating in this global initiative, the other being Trinidad and Tobago. So this overstates the importance that we in Barbados and the consultations and the leadership dialogues being here contribute significantly and represent the challenges being faced for the small and developing states in the Caribbean. So it really is an opportunity for us to highlight the context of SIDS and again, the sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So the objective of the national consultations is to stimulate an inclusive whole of society and whole of government dialogue on the main themes of the Stockholm Plus 50 as they relate to each national context. And this will be achieved through both virtual and in-person platforms for ideas, insights, and of course, and always innovation. I believe my colleague Mark Hill would appreciate that. So to join this week, this is the 3rd virtual consultation, and we'll be having an in-person consultation on May 3rd, which is next week, Tuesday, at the Hilton Hotel with a major focus on youth. This is again a partnership with the Ministry of Environment and also the Ministry of Youth Affairs, who are also involved in those consultations on Tuesday. It will also be streamed live, so for other persons who are unable to make it to the Hilton Hotel, you can also join the event and join the consultations virtually. So as mentioned, today's dialogue, accelerating the implementation of the environmental dimension of sustainable development in the context of a decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. So today should be an exciting course of dialogue, and definitely I'm looking forward to what is shared today. So the timeline for the Stockholm Plus 50 preparations coincide with the critical period for countries. Countries would have revised their enhanced national climate pledges, so their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, ahead of COP26 in Glasgow last year in November. And this defined critical targets and strategies for keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we all know within the region, for us, it's really the reality, stark reality, is that it's 1.5 to stay alive. And adapting to potential climate impacts and ensuring that financial flows required to achieving these global targets are met. So these pledges reflect and are integrated into national and sectoral development policies, strategies, budgets, and targets, including other environmental commitments. So the NDCs offer a key political signal on the direction of development that countries plan to take. So targets in the NDCs on energy, adaptation, nature-based solutions, gender, and other areas, they provide national pathways to transform economies and societies, and they contribute to many of the outcomes for Stockholm 50. So as such, the ongoing NDC revision, planning, and implementation process also will provide a strong foundation for the preparation of the meetings. So the UNDP recognizes that the NDCs as a critical gateway for ambitious action, not just to achieve the Paris Agreement, but towards the sustainable development goals on a whole. And the discussions and critical points raised during these leadership dialogues so far have been most informative. And I would like to end by thanking Professor Winston Moore, Ms. Crystal Drakes, Mr. Travis St. Clair, on behalf of the UNDP for their support in leading the dialogues. The UNDP's partnership with the Ministry of Environment and National Beautification and the University of the West Indies has been absolutely critical to leading a successful consultative process. And we look forward to robust discussions today, led by our panelists with strong input from all participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I just wish to introduce briefly to you our panelists. At this time, I'm simply going to let you know who they are and basically what they do. And after that, we will view a short video just to set the stage regarding Stockholm, taking us back to 1972 at the start of the Stockholm process. So first up, we have Mr. Mark Hill. And colleagues, if you can, please switch your cameras on so that our participants can see you live. Thank you so much. Mr. Mark Hill is the Chief Executive Officer of Export Barbados, formerly known as the BIDC. Then we have Professor Winston Moore. He is Professor of Economics, and he is also the Deputy Principal of the CAFIL campus, the University of the West Indies CAFIL campus here in Barbados. We also have Dr. David Bino, the National Coordinator for the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program Barbados at UNDP. We also have Dr. Erwin Adams, our clean tech representative today, and he is from Atoms Solutions Incorporated. And last but by no means least, Senator Dr. Christina Hines, head of department and senior lecturer, the Department of Government, Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that today's discussion is going to be fruitful, energetic, and quite informative. And really and truly, we are looking forward to you posting your questions and your comments in the chat, as well as having some interactive discussion. So please, once you raise your hand, you can make your comments. So again, to our panelists, thank you so much and welcome. So as promised, we will now look at a short video that sort of sets the stage for what Stockholm Plus 50 is all about.
In 1972, global leaders came together in Sweden for the first ever United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. It was unlike any previous event, bringing together 113 governments to discuss humanity's impact on the natural world. Now, 50 years after that Stockholm meeting, we face a triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. With this in mind, the UN General Assembly has decided to convene an international meeting entitled Stockholm Plus 50, a healthy planet for the prosperity of all, our responsibility, our opportunity. It will commemorate the 50 years since that 1972 watershed moment when the environment took center stage for the first time. There is only one Earth, and the stakes have never been higher. Join us.
Thank you very much. I just wish to make a sincere apology to our panelists, Dr. Erwin Edwards. I'm not sure where the Adams is coming from. Sincerest apologies, Erwin. I've known you long enough and should have been better at this by now. So again, our sincere apologies. And our panelist, Dr. Erwin Edwards from Atoms Solutions Incorporated. Thank you. So just to set the context for today's discussion, I'm just going to share with you some information based on the leadership dialogues and what we're hoping to pay attention to regarding, just to bring some focus to today's discussion. The challenges that our world is facing today require a deeper commitment to collective action, more so than before. Groundbreaking agreements were reached, first at the 1972 Stockholm Conference, the Rio +20 Summit in 2012, the Paris Climate Conference, and the Sustainable Development Goals Summit in 2015. All these agreements have been instrumental in laying pathways towards sustainable development. But are they enough, given that the world is fundamentally very different today? Science tells us that our planet, and thus the economies, societies, and the people that depend on it, is under severe and growing pressure. Another significant difference is reflected in the digital revolution. Nearly 5 billion people are now connected online, and at least 60% of global GDP is passing through digital channels. Over 4 billion people interact through social media, and 2 billion people consume through e-commerce platforms. At least 35 trillion US dollars of financing is now screened for environmental and social impacts. And digital technologies are holding companies to higher levels of transparency on the environmental performance of their value chains. Digital technologies can hardwire sustainability outcomes and behaviors directly into the platforms and algorithms of the digital economy. Perhaps more importantly, they can help drive the systemic and societal innovations and transformations needed to achieve environmental sustainability. For example, the electricity sector, smart asset planning and management, and energy storage could save up to 8.8 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions by 2025. So as the world starts to emerge from COVID-19, we are presented with the opportunity to build upon the momentum of recovery processes and redesign economies that are socially inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and which steer job creation and economic growth in the right direction. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to ask you to participate in our first poll of this session. So if just very briefly, we just want to get a sense of who is with us today. It's basically a demographic poll, so please go right ahead. The poll is up. Please enter your information, and then we will get into our discussions, or at least hearing from our panelists to give us a brief 5-minute overview. Thank you. Please participate in the poll if you can. Okay. Sam, any indication as to where we are with participation in today's poll?
Yes, thank you, Donna. We have 16 responses out of 21 participants so far. So I'll just start, give it another minute maybe to have the remaining answers, and then I'll start summarizing the data.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we now have 17 answers, and I think I will end the poll at this stage so we can pursue with the discussions afterwards. Thank you very much, everyone.
Great. Thank you as well, Sam, and thank you all for participating. So, and there we have our results for today. Yeah.
So as we can see, we have almost half of the audience is between the age of 31 and 50, but we also have a few representatives from youth with 6 members out of 17 respondents, which is very encouraging. There is very good gender balance today, which is also a very good indicator. Representatives come from a various number of stakeholder groups. We have representatives from the government, from the UN, from NGOs and CSOs, as well as private sector, and a large number from science and academia.
Great. Thanks for that, Sam. Very, very good. So we know what our audience sort of looks like today. So I'm going to start now by asking our esteemed panel to give us a 5-minute overview of exactly their thoughts on today's topic, which is accelerating sustainable development and the decade of action. And I'm going to begin with Mr. Mark Hill of Export Barbados. Thank you, Mark.
Good morning. Thank you. You know, it's funny opening back end. Normally, I come in middle order or back end to help bring in a few more runs. But let me get straight to the point. As far as really accelerating development, some of the key things that we need to focus on is from a mindset perspective. Barbados traditionally have a import substitution mindset. And that import substitution mindset lends itself to our net exports tend to be being negative. Now, why am I saying this in the context of a sustainability discussion? Because fundamentally, if we're going to build out our economy, is those sustainable tools that are central to giving us a positive net exports and a positive trade balance. So the angle in which we are coming at this from is not making environmental goals the central activity that drives uptake, but making economic goals the central activity that drives the uptake. So let me put it in its context. For example, we import just around $600 to $800 million in fossil fuel, just around $400 million US in fossil fuel. But 100% renewable energy target means that we are now generating that fossil fuel on site. We're now generating that energy on site. And the impact on our net exports is very, very, very positive. That would boost significant economic activity. It builds certain levels of resilience, and it also positions our product and service in the global space in that sustainable context. So for us, renewable energy, greening, and sustainability is central to economic growth. So it's more than just 1.5 to stay alive. For Barbados, it is about making sure that our dollar remains pegged, that is pegged in a very strong, sustainable way. It also means that we're creating new brand jobs, the jobs that we couldn't do before. And it's also building for us new export opportunities. So for example, we know that 1 gigawatt of renewable energy between wind, solar, biomass, all the different options will cover Barbados needs in a significant way for both transport, electricity, and industry. But we have identified 3 gigawatts of capacity. So we have a surplus, a net surplus of 2 gigawatts that we can export. So how do we export this sustainable energy? How do we export this and not only impact positively on our environment, but also impact positively on other economies' environment? So for example, there's a very strong agenda whereby we're looking to export green hydrogen in the very near future to ships and to other industry players across the globe. So we're taking that surplus of the 2 gigawatts and we're leveraging it for exports. And soon, you should be hearing soon some very heavyweight partners across the globe signing with Barbados as far as our green energy, green hydrogen program is concerned. So I will stop there for now. So fundamentally for us is about positive net exports. And that's why we drive the whole renewable energy. And that's what the Stockholm program means to us. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that overview, Mark. And we're also happy to hear about the ideas and some of the activities going forward. Very interesting indeed. Next up, Professor Winston Moore, who is no stranger to discussions, especially on green economy. Professor Moore, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you. Winston, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, I realized. Good morning. At least we got that out of the way. I'm the first one and hopefully the last one to do it this morning. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Donna, and good morning to my fellow panelists and everyone here in the meeting. As you would expect, I'm going to take a look at this from a green economy perspective and zero in on the whole notion of green finance in particular, because it is such a really important part of supporting sustainable development and supporting greening. And a lot of what we want to do in the future will come down to the whole notion of finance. Just a little bit of background on this idea of the green economy. Traditionally, in in economics, there's always been this dichotomy between the economy and the environment. So if you want to stimulate growth, it means that you have to utilize environmental resources. If you want to stimulate economic growth, it means that there's some degradation in terms of the environment that you have to accept will take place, and some biodiversity loss that will potentially happen. But the notion of green economy is that it says that no, that does not necessarily have to take place. You can stimulate growth in the economy while still supporting your environmental objectives, or you can stimulate growth in the economy while minimizing the potential damage on the environment that you're likely to see. And as a result, you're likely to see a lot of the industries that Mark was mentioning come into the forefront. The whole notion of renewable energy, recycling, and other sustainable projects are going to be very important going forward in the future. Now, how do we finance those projects in the future? Finance is such a really powerful enabler of human progress. Everything that we do in the economy depends on finance. And there's this very basic notion in economics in terms of how finance moves from one market to another market. The essential idea is that in global markets, funds are supposed to move from relatively high income countries with weak long-term growth prospects to low income countries with relatively strong growth prospects. And as funds move from these high income countries to these low income countries with really great growth prospects, it therefore supports what we economists know as economic convergence. So it pulls ahead, or it enhances economic growth in those relatively low income developing countries. And therefore you have a convergence in relation to per capita GDP across all of the countries on the globe. So economists spend lots of time looking at that notion of economic convergence. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I'm going to focus on the notion of finance and how do we support the green economy through green finance. So green finance is a type of future-oriented finance that simultaneously pursues the development of the financial industry, improvement of the environment, as well as economic growth. And there've been many really great financial products, green financial products developed over the last couple of years. We're seeing some of them introduced into the Barbados market now. And I would like to see a bit more introduced in the Barbados financial market, because they do play a really important role in terms of supporting the whole notion of sustainable development. One of the basic areas that I think there is a potential market for is our green cards or green credit cards. How these credit cards work is every time you spend in the supermarket, or every time you purchase a particular item, a small proportion of your expenditure is contributed to an NGO. It therefore provides financing for NGOs. We already have a system like this already in Barbados through our rewards cards. I think most of us have a rewards credit card in our pocket, and we build up rewards points and we cash those in for airline travel and those type of things. But this system can also be used to finance NGOs as well. Green car loans. So these loans can be used to finance the purchase of electric vehicles. Mark mentioned the whole notion of biofuels. Those are the type of things that can also be financed using green car loans as well. At the corporate level, then you start getting into some really interesting ideas. So the whole notion of green project finance then becomes particularly important. So how do you package finance to support a large renewable energy project? And this is something that we're going to have to start thinking about in Barbados. So it means pulling together different aspects of the financial system. So you'll have insurance providers, commercial banks, credit unions, and they can all come together to finance a large renewable energy project. And we're seeing some of that taking place right now in the market. Also, new members of the financial system who are traditionally part of supporting or financing investment in these areas can actually be really important. So an insurance company, for example, might find that investing in renewable energy projects might be quite useful for their portfolio, because insurance companies are looking for stable long-term returns. And if you invest in a renewable energy project, that is exactly what you're going to see. So for example, a PV farm, a wind farm, those generate stable returns over, say, a 25-year period. And that is exactly what an insurance company is looking for. Then just one final thing before I turn over the floor, the whole notion of weather derivatives. As you know, climate change is going to generate a significant changes in our environment. And we've already seen CRIF coming to the fore, providing weather derivatives for countries. And that is also probably going to emerge at the household level, where householders are going to be interested in purchasing insurance products for major disasters or major events as well. And that is something that might potentially come up in terms of the market. One final thing, I couldn't end without speaking about green taxes, because taxes provide finance for the public sector to invest in green projects. So we've already seen a few green taxes come to the fore, where there's taxes on fossil fuels at the pump already, and these generate revenues to help governments move from, say, relatively brown industries to green industries as well. And these are some of the things that we're going to see going forward in terms of green finance in developing countries. So Donna, I'm going to turn back over to you.
Thank you very much for that, Winston. A lovely overview, I must say, and showing us the importance of finance, and also for giving us some idea as to where we are going. I like the idea, of course, of, well, we know about green taxes. Some of us, I think, are not very happy sometimes, but we look forward to seeing the outcomes of this kind of taxation. Thanks, Winston. Next up, I'm going to now invite Dr. David Bino, who is the National Coordinator for the Global Environment Facility of the Small Grants Program with United Nations Development Program here in Barbados. David, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Sustainable development and the decade of action. We're looking at acceleration, and we must first ground this in sustainable development, which we should all know. If we don't know, you know, it's looking at current activities that this generation, you know, is engaged in, that does not make future generations any worse off with reference to the economy, society, and the environment. But if we had to look within and be very honest with ourselves, we would conclude that there are many areas that we're failing our youth, and there are many areas that we're failing future generations to come. Now, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals allow us to keep track in an objective manner at a national and global level. But with few exceptions, we are generally progressing too slow, and in some cases, moving in the wrong direction. And that's why the decade of action becomes very relevant between 2020 to 2030. And it's a bit ironic that when it started, we then had the pandemic, which would have caused some SDGs to go in the wrong direction. But we are seeking to accelerate sustainable solutions for some of the largest problems we face in the world, ranging from poverty, gender, to climate change, and inequality, and also closing that finance gap. When we look at it, it is tied to our historic commitments that were made between UN member states, which includes the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, associated, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Management, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, on financing for development. And we just can't forget the Paris Agreement on climate change. But as you know, a member of the team with the Just Small Grants Program, which really embodies sustainable development at the community level, taking community action with a global impact, I have to ensure that you understand that at the center of sustainable development and this era of implementation, this decade of action, lies civil society. Agenda 2030 makes it very clear that no one should be left behind, but it also underscores the importance and the central role that civil society plays in implementing these global commitments to facilitate the type of transformation and the future that we all want. I also must make it clear that in addition to implementation, civil society plays a key role and several roles as well in pushing for new laws, programs, policies, strategies, and in holding governments accountable to their commitments. They also identify the lack of joint government responses, and they seek to ensure that national policy, would not forget the most poor and vulnerable among us. So that must be said. Now, this decade of action that we're talking about could also be reframed or returned the decade of implementation of sustainable development policy. And as a sustainable development practitioner myself, what I'm going to do for you is just quickly, in less than 5 minutes, give you about 10 years worth of research in relation to sustainable development policy implementation. Because in the Caribbean and with Barbados, we have no shortage of good policies. Our problem is implementation. So if we can't implement properly, we can't accelerate implementation. So in a nutshell, if you have a book, if you have a pencil, if you have an iPad, if you have anything, you're going to take some notes because this is going to be very, very important information to have in a very brief period of time. Firstly, my experience has demonstrated that successful sustainable development policy implementation cannot be achieved without 4 main factors. And these factors are, you should note these: motivation, cognition, you can also term it awareness, resources or power, let's call it power, and accountability. Those 4 things: motivation, cognition, power, and accountability. Successful sustainable development policy implementation is always achieved when you have a high level of these 4 factors, when they're present. And my experience over the years and research was demonstrated that this implementation, this acceleration that we're seeking is normally driven by the most positive actors among us. So if you look within the meeting here, you would realize and recognize many of the faces that are here in the persons present, because these are some of the people who are driving sustainable development in Barbados, and these are the most highly motivated persons among us. So if we're supposed to accelerate development, we can't depend on only those few. We have to motivate and get others motivated to join the implementation, right? Because it's driven by the most positive actors. If the most positive actor is the implementer, and that's the problem in our case, many times the most positive actor, the most motivated actor would be international development organizations and governments, and some civil society organizations. But that creates a problem in itself, because when those are the most positive actors, they often tend to, in a sense, force implementation or force cooperation, because they may say, well, here's a pot of funds, we want you to do X or Y. But that may not be contextually appropriate to the type of development that we want for Barbados, that we want for the Caribbean. And therefore, the acceleration, because actors are not motivated in that area, you can't accelerate it because it lacks motivation. We also have to look at the other point, that to maximize and to accelerate implementation, is important that the process is ultimately owned not at the top, but at the bottom. It must be a bottom-up approach where the actors are motivated to do so. So again, we have this imbalance where you're seeing that policy comes down from the top, and then we say to civil society, we want you to do X or Y, or we want you to program in these areas. But civil society should actually own the process, and they say to us, and that's why the Just Small Grants program is very well placed for that, because they say to us, these are our problems, and these are our solutions to our problems. It's bottom up, and therefore you have highly motivated actors to address these issues. But how can you get those persons highly motivated? And that goes to the other point, cognition, that awareness. And therefore, when we look at these dialogues, when we look at, even if we look back at the green economy scope and study, it found that we needed to build awareness, we need to educate the public, because only when we educate them and let them understand that these policies are aligned to their interests, would they become highly motivated. And because there's this imbalance of cognition, where the persons who develop the policies generally have more awareness of these policies than those who are supposed to materialize them at the bottom level, that's why you have this slow pace of implementation, because we're not all on one page. But the good news is that this gap of cognition could be filled if we can get both parties motivated, they can learn from each other. And that's important to note. But in addition to this, I want to place a special emphasis on accountability. Often we have policies being developed, and we have a lack of accountability. And there's no different when it comes to the SDGs. We try to create frameworks across the world to get this data back in, but there's still the level of data, the quality of data is not as good as it should be. And therefore, there's a accountability gap there, because when you have policies, how often do we go back to government and say, what is your progress on this? How often do they come back to us and say, this is our progress in this area? And if we don't have accountability, not only from government and international development partners, but also from civil society and the private sector, if they're not accountable, then implementation will not be adequate and it cannot be accelerated within that context. And the final point in relation to this is the whole notion of the imbalance of power. Imbalance of power always impacts negatively on the rate and the adequacy of implementation. Now, let's bring this home a bit more, because sustainable development policy implementation is really an exercise in multi-level governance. And in the context of SIDS, this has really weakened many governments below the state. So before, there was more power could be had in, organizations and institutions below the state. We're now dispersing power above the state. So more to the CARICOM level, more to the level of the UN, and so forth. And there's no problem with dispersing power above and giving more authority at that level, but we must also empower people at the ground level. We must also empower civil society. We must also empower local level governance, because that's how you get policy that is appropriate to the context. And that's how you get people motivated, because they can see how it benefits them and then they want to implement. Now, this demonstrates that this imbalance has led to policies that have been dominated by supranational perspectives. So you're speaking about climate change, adaptation, and mitigation that may not be contextually appropriate for Barbados. Adaptation at one site may not look the same in Barbados. And therefore, we need to have that appropriate level of contextualization. And as I close, we have really been seeing, policies that are sometimes mixed fits. And that's why these type of dialogues like the Stockholm are important, because we get that local level contextualization. We get the opportunity for persons to have a say. And within that context, we have to also acknowledge, and a point was made in a earlier discussion, whereby we often think that our resources have to come from outside. It has to come from an international organization, but we have scope within our own 166 square miles to create creative, innovative financing mechanisms. And when we do that, we put more power into the nation state. And in addition to that, we allow for further contextualization of the type of policies that we want to implement. Now, in my closing words, I would say that in the contextual nature of sustainable development policy, it makes it very clear that, if we are supposed to implement sustainable development policies and we want to accelerate it, we must first undertake an appropriate behavioral analysis. We must understand the policy attributes that should be included in order to maximize the motivation of those persons involved. And that would ensure that we have voluntary participation. We must also identify what are the cognitive or cognition gaps that have to be addressed, the lack of awareness, education, the capacity that has to be built. We must ensure that there are accountability mechanisms that we can keep track, and that the appropriate resources are available to support this transition, because we can't have policy, but we don't have the resources to implement. I think Mark spoke about that. Professor Winston Moore spoke about that. That's very important. So when we have these two things together, we can realize that we can balance this approach to sustainable development implementation, and we can accelerate it. Thank you. I look forward to the further dialogue on this with the panel and also with participants. God bless.
Thank you very much, David. Very comprehensive. I do like that you've outlined the enabling factors for accelerating sustainable development. I know that these are things that some of us in this grouping have heard many times over, but in terms of what we are trying to do, and we are using the Stockholm process for this, we do need to take action. Point taken and much appreciated. So next up, I'm now going to invite Dr. Erwin Edwards, of Atoms Solutions Incorporated, to give us his feedback and his overview as it relates to this topic. Welcome, Erwin, and thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Donna, for the invitation, and good morning to all my colleagues, a number of familiar faces here. Who would have been just as confused as I am to see Erwin Adams, since most of you know me. Nevertheless, I don't have to change my birth certificate or any of my credit cards or my green cards. So that's a good thing. Or I'll try to stay in my lane, looking at clean tech and the role that it would play in sustainable development. We commenced the project, we meaning Atoms Solutions, commenced the project last year, looking at clean tech, which is really a short for clean technologies, which, as you would appreciate, might include a number of things. So in looking at the project, we would have first looked at the stakeholders who we thought were critical to the process. We had a number of consultations, much like this one, and we created a concept paper for a virtual platform that would allow the requisite collaboration to occur between the stakeholders. And this would have included University of West Indies. We had Dr. Regina Henry involved in that. It would have included Fair Trade Commission, who is concerned about regulation and customer protection, etc. Of course, Bloom, which comes under Mark of the agency, Export Barbados, and a number of other persons would have been involved. So we did that, and so we now have a blueprint for a platform that can begin to bring people together to have the conversations that we need to have. So we looked at some key areas that we thought were important for clean tech, and this should help to make it clear what it really is. One of the first pillars was the circular economy, a phrase that I'm sure you've heard before. Implied in that is the linear economy, which is something we're trying to move away from. We are, and this really touches on what the point Mark made about our mindset. We're accustomed to purchasing materials, we use them to make something or deliver service, and something is left over and we throw it away. So it comes in and it goes out. And that is a linear economy that really does not promote the most efficient use of resources. And it ends up in a number of byproducts ending up in our landfills, in our environment that don't need to be there. So cleaning that up is one issue, but also looking at all of the possible opportunities that would arise if you found a good use for that. So the circular economy deals with things that we know, like recycling, reusing, remaking, resource efficiency, these types of things. So that was one element that we looked at. So the other element which seemed a bit more pointed was clean technologies. And for us, the more relevant clean technologies refer to renewable energies, where we're looking to substitute all the fossil fuel-based technologies, replacing with clean technologies, resulting in fewer or zero emissions going into our environment. And then there's the ICTs and smart technologies and digitization, yeah, where we look at doing things better. And to be able to appreciate that, if we can do that, it's just not a matter of being high tech. You know, it's not just a matter of being able to do things that we see happening in the first or second world countries. It is also about preserving our environment, because if I don't need to drive downtown and fill out 25 papers, sit in somebody's waiting room for half an hour, wasting my time, of course, then to hear that I missed the signature or I'm short one sheet, I need to travel back home and fix that and come back. That is a waste of fuel on the road, my time, and occasionally I do need to remind people of the value of my time. My time has a value, it means something. But if that process can be conducted from my desk, right? Yes, it's high tech and it's great to feel good about that, but I'm also saving trees, I'm saving fuel, I'm saving time and getting things done quicker. So there are lots of efficiencies that result. So technology is just not the thing for us to talk about, as a pie in the sky. It is something that has real value. So we looked at those clean technologies, including the renewables, which is the energy part, but also the smart technology that allows us to get to where we want to be in a shorter space of time. And then we also looked at the cross-cutting areas, Because what we found is that there are lots of people doing things in a little silo, but we can achieve so much more together. That sounds like somebody's slogan, a bank or somebody. We can achieve so much more together. So we identified some key sectors that we started to look at: tourism, agriculture, construction, transportation, manufacturing, retailing, and of course there are others. But if we can get these key sectors to work together, to do joint projects, look at common problems together, to come up with solutions, then we will be able to do better. And the final area is very critical, and that's the support area, where we address the issues of public awareness, education, something that David touched on, incentivization, looking at our research and development budgets to explore these things, looking at the regulatory environment, enforcement, monitoring these things. These are not clean tech functions, but they are necessary in order to move clean tech forward. But the industry itself has lots of challenges. We do have a cluster, as I said, under BIDC, the Blue Cluster, and there are barriers to their progress. One, incentivization. There's not a lot of motivation, as David spoke about it. There's not a lot of incentive for people to begin to do more of the right thing. So we need to look at that. Operational enhancements. We have a case where, yes, company A may go to a farm and get access to all their produce that they're unable to sell. Instead of throwing it away, they may be able to go to, say, farmer X and they get the materials. I can go do that because I know him. Maybe he likes me. But then Dr. Hines goes and she requests the same thing, and the guy says, could you please exit my property? So there's a discrepancy. I need to like you, or you need to know me, or there's always some other thing going on other than doing the right thing, other than following a policy or a mandate or something that says to me, I need to do the right thing, so that when persons come to me for what is quote unquote my waste material, I understand that I need to supply, or we organize ourselves in a way so that waste material goes to a common place. But we've started. We do some separation with our garbage these days. We have a bigger plan for it, which I'll touch on in a few minutes, but we need to create those enhancements in operations. Sector visibility. Some people have never even heard about clean tech sector. One can argue it's not a real sector, because if we apply the traditional criteria to what the sector is, clean tech falls very short. So maybe we should call it an emerging sector, because this is an area that has tremendous potential, even though we may not see anything much as yet to help to offset the trade deficit. We may not see anything as yet that will substitute for some of the products we import, but we are working on it. And so we need to pay attention to the sector so it can develop. Cross-sector synergies, I hinted at that before. Market acceleration, we're all here talking about that. We are doing some of the right things, but we are moving so slowly. So we need to accelerate that. And more importantly, market education. People need to know about and understand the sector, understand what the clean tech companies are trying to do so that they can support it. And if they have a valid reason, they can oppose it. But then you can deal with the opposition. But if they don't know about you, they'll just pass you by and don't know if they missed an opportunity or not. So those are some of the barriers. But one of the biggest challenges that I see in the sector really is the lack of broad participation. How many of us are involved in any way in helping to recycle anything or reuse or repackage, or really involved in creating cleaner products? Not many people are involved. If you think of example about the Blue Box program, this is a SSA program. We've all now got our nice new garbage cans, and we have that blue box in it. That reports are that these boxes are being used for all kinds of things, putting babies in, planting food, which Minister in the room might be happy to hear about the food, but that's not the purpose for them. They're being used for things that you cannot imagine. It is so serious that the estimates from SSA is that if they get 50% participation, they would be over the moon. So when you think about it, half the boxes that we put out there, the blue boxes, we are not even expecting to bring anything back to us that is recyclable, right? Which is not good, but that unfortunately is a picture of the mindsets and the culture that we live in. So in the work that we're doing, we intend to put some very specific policies before government. Dr. Bino mentioned that there's no shortage of policies. I would agree. He said that the problem is implementation. I would also agree. But there's another intermediary problem, and that is that many of the policies really do not impact the sector. They are there, but they really are not relevant to the sector. There are lots of policies to do with marine pollution. How many people does that impact? Yes, some. Mostly ships, of course, they're on the high seas. There are policies to do with disposal of toxic waste. Yes, that is important, but how many of us generate toxic waste? But we need policies that will impact the average person, the average business, because then when you can get them to respond, you see a difference. 5% of our waste does not go to the landfill, which means that 95% would have been destined to the landfill up until a few years ago. So just 5% we were able to divert, right? Which is very small. They've made recent changes to the point where we are seeing a larger volume of diverters now, but an impactful one. Do you know we used to send all of our construction waste to landfills? Trees, gravel, cement, metal, wire, and these things are not compactable. You cannot compact a piece of a hotel that you knock down. You can't compact it. And these things occupy significant volumes in the landfill. But that has not now been diverted to old quarries, which makes sense. So as we have mined the substance on the earth, we now put back in the cement and the things that we can't compact. And that now allows our landfills, instead of lasting 10 to 12 years, they can now be looking at 20 years. So the landfill, for example, that we have now going in St. Thomas, I think that was open in 2012. So this year that was supposed to be coming to an end, but there's right now lots of capacity in it because we've diverted a lot of that. See, when we divert plastics, it's good, but it doesn't help the landfill a whole lot beyond the environmental impact because it's light. It's very light. So diverting all of our plastics would be 0.0% of what goes into the landfill. But large things, concrete, these things make a difference. So we have some specific policies that I will just mention. There's just 10 of them. 1, create a package of incentives to businesses. 2, enhance our waste management and related facilities. 3, boost engagement and market education. 4, develop an ICT professional certification regime. You might be wondering what that is. That is a way of us certifying that our professionals can deliver products or services to a particular standard. So when you engage them and they are certified, you know what to expect. But when I invite you to come and start out my network, allow me to do digitization, and you're doing it because you saw it done. There's an interesting ad on TV right now about accreditation, where one guy saw a video and he's now a surgeon and this kind of thing. You want people that are certified. So we need a regime for them. Yes, we know they're very skilled. I know lots of great, smart technology guys, but we need them to be certified, like the doctors, like the engineers, like the lawyers. We need to know they can get it done. We need policies to look at. We need policies for large businesses. There's hardly 2 large businesses that have got an energy policy. If you're consuming significantly, you need to have an energy policy so that you can align yourself with the national energy policy. We need to streamline and accelerate implementation of business to business and business to customer electronic solutions. The average man needs to be able to get his transaction done electronically and not need to be in lines walking around with bills in their hands and paper and stuff like that. So that needs to be accelerated. We need to update our policy. We still need a comprehensive environmental policy and a circular economy policy. Policy 8, establish minimum requirements for homes and businesses of a certain size as it relates to renewable energy. So you can build your mansion on a hill, that's great. but we need to make sure you have X percentage of renewable energy on your roof. In Israel, you can have, you know, companies that walk into Israel and they want to set up a business. Fine, do it, but you need to generate 40% of your own energy. That's a requirement. But we don't do that. We just say, okay, set it up because this is foreign indirect investment. Just set it up. We're glad to have you, and that's enough. It's not enough. We need to create disposal of equipment and material policies. We have, it's been estimated right now that we have about $6 million in devices that's either thrown in the back of your cupboard or disposed of in your garbage. $6 million worth of cell phones and similar devices that we make nothing off of. That is an opportunity, not to mention preserving our landfills and our environment. And finally, digitization. We need to encourage and, if necessary, mandate businesses of a certain size to digitize. Get rid of 75 papers for me to sign. The lawyers won't be happy about this, but we need to move on from all of this paper and all of this time and wasting time. So these are 10 specific policies the project has produced so far that we have connected with 3 ministries, and we would support them in pushing these through so that they can become a reality. And I would pause there since my 3 minutes is probably up, and Donna can have back the other 4.
Thank you very much, Erwin. Very thought-provoking. There is someone in the audience, I think it's Legina Henry, who is actually saying, great point, Dr. Edwards, about organizations having energy policies aligned in the national energy policy. So very good points. And we do like, we are happy to hear about your 10 policies / solutions going forward. So thanks again for your input. And now on to Dr. Christina Hines, the head of department and senior lecturer for the Department of Government, Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology, University of the West Indies, Cayfield campus. Thank you very much, Dr. Hines. Looking forward to hearing you. Senator Dr. Hines, my apologies.
Good morning. Thank you for this invitation. Mark noted his concerns about being the opening batter, let's say, not batsman, as I am not a man. And, you know, the closing one sometimes has some issues too. You can either be the hero, the one that saves the match, or the one that everybody is stooping and walking home while you're batting because they ain't saying nothing. So we'll see which one I am. So thank you for this invitation. There's a lot of food for thought in all of the presentations that went before, and I am really thankful for them because they have allowed me to cross some things off of what I had written down here to say. I did want to talk about e-waste a little bit. I also wanted to talk about things such as recycling. I do use my blue box for recycling. I get a collection. Actually, I have 2. One is not mine. I use my neighbor's as well because it has been repurposed. It was repurposed for mosquito collection. So I asked if I could use it to gather up my recyclables. And, you know, on that point, I think a lot of this has to do with convenience as well. And when things are inconvenient or people don't know how they will work, then perhaps they don't take them up. But I digress completely. I wanted to talk in thinking about Stockholm plus 50, about what this really can mean and how we can approach this. And I looked at a document that is available online from the Stockholm plus 50 website and so on. It is called The Impact of the Stockholm on the UN System, Reflections on 50 Years of Environmental Action, and this is the interim report. And one of the things that stood out to me was a point about decoupling economic development from its destructive footprint. And I know that Professor Mohammed made a point about this and Professor in the chat, and Professor Winston Moore brought this up to some degree when he was talking about the green economy. And I think this is a continued issue in our region and something that we need to take seriously in the next 10 years. Because while we do have some very interesting initiatives and some very worthwhile initiatives, in particular relating to alternative energy. There's a lot of innovation in this area. The Barbados government is putting quite a bit of emphasis on this to its credit. We heard Mark Hill talk about some of these initiatives as well, not just for domestic use, but also for export. I think there is a level of, and David Bino spoke about this, a misfit. And I would go even beyond saying a misfit to say that there are significant contradictions in our approaches to development. And I do not think these are taken seriously enough. While we publicize the wonderful things we are doing to address climate change and other issues, we treat as separate the things that we do that are truly contradictory and potentially devastating, I will say. So I want to go back a little bit just to think about our region in context. And one of the things I want to say is that this is a region in our country, Barbados, as well as the entirety of the Caribbean, has been built on extraction, on very destructive extraction, so that our landscape as we know it today, Barbados as we know it, exists as it does because of significant environmental degradation. So we have all of these cane fields and houses and so on. What was there before? We know about the existence of the mongoose and certain things that we eat. What was the mongoose brought here to do? To destroy wildlife. The cane fields were put here, you know, at the expense of whatever existed before, forests and so on. So this is an area that has seen, this country and this region has seen significant environmental degradation as part and parcel of building an economy, which was initially to serve empire, not to serve us. And I still think that we grapple with this in the way that we have structured our economies in ways that continue to be very extractive and environmentally harmful. And I know I don't really want to be getting down on tourism as such, but I do think that tourism, which is one of the significant drivers of our economies in the region. I have some information here that says the Caribbean is the most tourism intensive and tourism dependent region in the world in terms of the value of the economic contribution of this single sector. And this is from Canonier and Burke, 2019, as well as the Caribbean Tourism Organization in 2020. We're very dependent on tourism. And a 1% increase in tourism, we are told, can lead to between 0.03% increase in economic growth and 1% depending on the country. And because of this, the emphasis on tourism has its merits. But if we look at how we do tourism, it continues to be extremely extractive, harmful, and a dirty sector that I don't think we have adequately come to terms with as yet. So while we can focus on the ways in which we can get tourism providers to use renewable energy, to invest in this as part of what Mark was talking about, not just for our domestic use, but also for export, there's a much larger question we need to ask about this sector, the way it is structured, packaged, sold, and marketed around the world. And also in response to the types of persons, younger people, who want to travel and be engaged in tourism today. Some of the things that they're demanding are not necessarily the old luxury tourism products. And on this, I want to say just a little bit about coastal tourism and how damaging this is, and also how foolish it is in some ways as well, considering a lot of what we know about climate change. I just have some more information here, and there are studies that reach as far back as the 1980s for the Caribbean that highlight the implications of beach erosion and sea level rise for coastal tourism. This element of tourism development remains dominant in the region. Scott, Simpson, and Sim record 906 properties across 19 Caribbean states and territories that are likely to be vulnerable to beach erosion, sea level rise. And yet we continue to promote this type of tourism, which to me is just remarkable when we go on the world stage and we talk about the effects of climate change, when we talk about how vulnerable this region is. And we should remember that this region of small island developing states actually hosts the largest concentration of small island developing states in any one place in the world, right? And we continue to do this. These researchers project that Anguilla, Belize, British Virgin Islands, St. Kitts and Nevis, Turks and Caicos could lose half of their coastal tourism properties with devastating economic repercussions with a 1 meter rise in sea level, right? And yet we have seen recently in Barbados along Bay Street, there's some kind of water that's coming in where Miss Ram's property was and where the Hyatt is supposed to be built. We don't know exactly where it's coming from, why it is settling there. And while we continue to emphasize how critical sustainable development is, how much we must consider adaptation to climate change, we are supposed to be going ahead with this significant tourism investment right on the coastline, knowing everything that we know. So what I'm really saying here is it's nothing about tourism per se, because I think there are significant ways that we can do tourism differently, and the Caribbean Tourism Organization has put out a sustainable tourism policy since 2005, and they remodeled it in 2020. And there are some very useful provisions in there that I think we need to take a lot more seriously, because this is the driving sector in our economy, and it continues to be so. I think we have to look at, when we look at the SDGs, one of them deals with life below water, SDG 14. We need to look at cruise tourism. As I opened my newspaper yesterday, I see with much fanfare that we are engaging in these relationships with cruise ships. What are the demands we are making on this sector to ensure that life below water, this important element of biological diversity, is not going to be harmed by people coming to play and enjoy themselves in the region? These are really serious concerns I think we need to focus on as we go forward the next 10 years and beyond. Before I finish, I also want to talk about two things very quickly. One has to do with, again, this kind of schizophrenia that I think that we have, where we are very concerned, and I don't want to underemphasize all of the good work that the government of Barbados is doing. And I would also say the previous government did in terms of renewable as well, and getting some of these energy policies off of the ground, because they are doing very good work and the ideas are excellent. But then we have this contradiction where we are still involved in offshore oil exploration in the sea. I can't really make good sense of this, because if we are so serious and so concerned about emissions and about life below the sea, how is it that this is the kind of activity we are engaging in towards economic development? How and why? Yes, we know why, it is lucrative, but does this not contradict these other things that we are focusing on if we are really taking this seriously? And this is nothing about Barbados. This has to do with the region. We can look at Guyana. Guyana is doing quite well now because of its oil and gas sector. And I don't think that anybody can really blame them in terms of dollars and cents for wanting to do this. But this is also a place that houses a significant portion of the Amazon. How do we deal with these two things? How do we ensure that what we do for economic development, for growth, for government policy makes sense over the next 10 years if we are going to address the serious environmental problems that exist on this planet? And we can add Trinidad and Tobago to this as well, which is a champion of dealing with climate change on the international level. But if we are being honest and we are looking at what happens in Trinidad and Tobago in that oil and gas sector, there are some big questions we truly need to ask about this misfit, right? Or schizophrenia, as I would prefer to call it. The last thing that I want to talk about, just barely touch my finger on, is population size, migration. And if we go back to the same 1972, when we had the Stockholm conference, I wasn't alive, but I've read about it. We also had the Club of Rome's limits to growth. and the Ecologist magazine's A Blueprint for Survival. And they raise concerns about population size, kind of carrying capacity, what people have called these neo-Malthusian arguments. Some of them have been rubbished. But I do think we have to take these things seriously when we consider some policies that people don't necessarily connect to the environment. So when we consider, for instance, migration policies and the ways in which some places, Barbados in particular, have been making this argument that we need more people in the country without, in my opinion, taking seriously the resource demands that larger populations will bring on water resources, how are we managing our waste, the provision of energy, clean energy, and one of the SDGs deals with clean and affordable energy. And right now, the affordability of energy is a big question. So what are the environmental implications of focusing on inviting and encouraging people to come to Barbados, for instance, because they can bring investment, expertise, jobs, without thinking about this other side? And with that, I will rest. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Christina. Quite comprehensive. Again, very good food for thought. So ladies and gentlemen, we have heard from our panelists, and we've heard quite good information, I would say. I'm going to jump right into provoking some conversation based on some of the comments that I've been seeing in the chat. And once again, we've got Professor Robin Mahan with us, and Professor Winston Moore. I think I'm going to come at you with this question, or at least this comment and question from Professor Mahan. And he says that Winston would have noted that development is inevitably at the expense of the environment. Clearly, this continues indefinitely. If this continues indefinitely, there will be little or no environment left. How and when can we, or should we, set limits on degradation that we are not prepared to go beyond? So Winston, I'm starting with you on this particular query from Professor Mahan. And perhaps then I will ask Professor Mahan to give his thoughts as to what we can actually do. Cool. Thank you, Winston.
Thank you very much, Donna. I think what Prof has touched on is actually not only good for the environment, but also good economics. And the way how I'm going to tackle this is by looking at some examples. If you think about tourism, when persons come to Barbados, they're looking for some place that is exotic. And the tourism officials are therefore looking to sell that brand image. So if you were to try to attract as many persons as possible to the market, you therefore lose that image, that notion of an exotic destination. So having some limits in terms of how many tourists that you're going to attract in a particular year might actually be quite useful. Looking at it from another perspective where Mark might want to come in, if one of the really great success stories for Barbados has been our rum industry. And what we have done in recent years is that we haven't been trying to sell more rum. We've actually been trying to go into more value added and selling at a higher price point. And so therefore the goal is not only just to sell rum, but also to sell higher value added rum. And so just like how you have wines that are priced at $200, $400 a barrel, that's where we should be aiming at as a country. So yes, Prof, I do think that limits are actually quite useful from an environmental perspective, but they are actually quite useful economic policies as well, because they point you towards what you should be aiming at. You should be aiming at greater value added, greater efficiencies in terms of production. And these goals have a number of benefits for the country as well, with in particular the whole notion of wages, because if you're selling at a higher price point, you can then start offering workers in the industry higher wages as well. So you have not only benefits for the owner of the business, but also for employees as well. So some notion of limits is actually quite useful economics as well.
Thank you very much, Winston. Robin? Okay. Robin, we're having some audio issues coming from your mic, right? Something seems a bit off, Robin. I don't know if you, yeah, we know that that's not your voice that we're hearing. So your audio is not only going in and out, but the pitch of it seems a little off. I don't know if there's something going on with your speakers. Mhm. Okay, and it's a pity because I really, really wanted to hear you on this. Okay. So while we are having, okay, so Robin, we'll come back to you, hopefully very shortly. I know that given some of what Erwin had to say in terms of where we need to go next and the kinds of policies, et cetera, that he has put forward, there are 10 policies to be exact. I see that Travis Sinclair from the Ministry of Environment, who deals with policy, is in the room. Travis, could you respond to some of Erwin's, some of what Erwin has put forward this morning, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yeah, I'll respond to some. I guess I didn't listen to the entire presentation. I was actually in two other meetings. I mean, and interestingly, there is a meeting going on now. Dr. Brewster is here. I know he's monitoring both, but one dealing with coral reef vulnerability assessments. And we were also dealing with a matter on blue economy. And I raised these because Erwin, he did speak about a digital transition and the connect with ICTs and the clean tech sector. But one of the things I think that we have to be mindful of as we build out policies, and I fully support the idea of the clean tech sector. I fully support the policy scope that Erwin expressed. But what I will say is that we need to look at the life cycle of those policies, or for lack of a better, I guess the impact assessment associated with policies and how we transition. The government of Barbados, and certainly my ministry, and I have my permanent secretary here, I want to acknowledge MPS Brown, is in terms of this digital transition, brings opportunity, but it brings a burden in terms of being able to stay on top of all of the various gateways into your space. And there are things associated with, be it yesterday, I believe a meeting in the UN was hacked. Fully taken over. So as we build out a clean transition, a digital transition, we need to look at this in a holistic way. And I say that because I want to even bring it back to the renewable energy sector. Christina made some interesting points in terms of, as we talk about resource extraction and whatnot, and the convenience and this transition. But one issue that we will be faced with is, are the minerals required to support the renewable energy sector? And you hear rare earths, etc. You hear also persons mining landfills to get these things and whatnot. So whatever the transition is, the technology transition, we seem to never work out the impact, the true life cycle, and plan for that transition. And I think we are a more educated race today, and be it clean tech or others, I feel it is important that those issues be considered. Just again on the point of the life cycle as well. I'm a beef lover, but I'm not happy with the amount of liters, gallons of water that go into just a small portion of beef. And that water footprint that we were so busy looking at. Why is this important? Because the Caribbean, as the climate changes, drought will become the thing. And again, we have to work out these transitions, and then we are talking about handing the planet over to the next generation. And our consumption habits today, I agree that we need to be able to check those things. Professor Moore, and know that I'm on the phone, I mean, know that I'm on speaking, as we talk about the economy and making it more sustainable, there are all these, I guess, conflicting things again, because we want to pursue development, then we're graduated, our human development index, we're performing better, we're being asked to be more competitive because the business sector, at the end of the day, provides the jobs. We want growth, we're drunk on growth. And again, Robin talked about limits to growth, but the world and all the metrics surrounding how countries perform are stacked in a particular way. Yes, there's been talk about green indices, but for the main, these are still the things that govern us. And again, we have to be able to change the metrics of development, which we've been talking about again, I mean, back again from 1972. But we haven't been, you know, we aren't able to, for some reason, to find the will to do that. The last thing, as I said on Monday, is for all of us, we are consumers. The business case for renewable energy transition, a clean tech transition, a digital transition, starts with demand. And I think it's really within us that we have to ask ourselves, if we really are serious about this planet, how can we change our habits? Businesses wait for us to say what we want. Our politicians respond to what we want. So I'm saying the responsibility really starts with all of us if we're serious about handing this planet in a better position. And I will say to you, as I look back at it 50 years, and I'm a 1972 child, are we handing a planet in a better position? For me, the jury is still out. I see progress. I see the Rio conventions. I see the plan of action. I see the IMF establishing a resilience and sustainability trust fund. People are no longer walking around, for the most part, barefoot. Waters, bathrooms, and houses. Hygiene is better. But are we really handing it over in a better position? I think there's more information out there, but I think there's a lot that still needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that overview, Travis. I'm going to go to Robin next, but I'd like very quickly just to share Dr. Peggy Antrobus's comments. She says, I agree with David that sustainable development must address imbalances of power, specifically between classes and gender. In relation to class, we have to go beyond poverty reduction to income inequality in terms of gender. It's not just about the representation of women at the top, but about fundamental issues such as violence and unwaged work in the household. I don't see any progress in these areas. And this is one of the reasons why strategies such as the SDGs are greeted with skepticism. The pandemic has made us pause and think. This is an opportunity for rethinking, for charting a new course, to go beyond economics and technology, to give serious consideration of values. We have to consider issues of equity, cooperation, solidarity, and participation. And also building on something that Travis mentioned again, we need to change our behaviors. I think David would have made that point in his intro as well, that perhaps we need to assess behaviors and look at how we do what we do. And certainly, Erin, if we're going to be looking at circular economy, then we do have to change the mindsets. We do have to change people's behaviors so that they are looking more at what happens to resources and the value that is embodied in some of the things that basically make up our waste streams. So thank you all for that. So now, Robin, over to you to respond to your initial comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donna. I won't say a lot because I've heard a lot of really good ideas here today, and many of which point towards the fact that we all understand that there's a need for limits. Travis used the term limits to growth, which I think we have to use very guardedly because it can easily be seen as seeking to stop development. Which is definitely not the case. I think it is limits to certain kinds of growth. And what kinds of growth do we want limits to? Needs to be the topic of a discussion. I don't see it as it's a discussion here, but I don't see it as a part of the broader conversation in the press or anywhere else in Barbados as to what kinds of limits we want to place on certain kinds of growth. And I think it's a much bigger topic, really, if we step back, because we're really talking about what we want to see as a lifestyle or a way of living for Barbadians into the future. And others have spoken to the fact that if we do various kinds of development, we're going to suffer consequences. But I just want to emphasize that I think certainly we are bounded by ecosystem limits. And if we transcend those, we are going to suffer. But there are many different kinds of ecosystem limits. And we need to have conversations around all of those which are relevant and which matter to Barbados. So I think I would really like to see a much more frequent and full discussion of what kinds of limits we are facing and what kind of a lifestyle or standard of living we want to see down the road in Barbados. And by standard, I don't mean just material. I mean the aspects that pertain to well-being, access to healthy ocean, access to healthy nature, and so forth, which are increasingly becoming understood as critical to human well-being. So, I mean, right now we actually have a pretty high footprint in Barbados, and we need to really be looking at that and trying to steer ourselves perhaps away from the extent of consumerism that we have enjoyed. And again, this is a very difficult discussion because there are many who do not enjoy the standard of living and who, it has to be said carefully and clearly that the intention is not to stop us in time where we are, but to really steer us more carefully towards a more equitable and limit conscious country. I hope that has made some sense. And so thanks for the opportunity to say that.
Thanks very much, Robin. And thanks for the clarification. You did touch as well on Mrs. and Dr. Antrobus's comment on inequality. If we are going to be setting limits, are we indeed going to be taking that imbalance further afield? And I don't think we want to do that, but yes, we do have to consider what is required for our existence. And as Travis also mentioned, what are we really handing over to our next generations? So great interaction so far. So I'm just going to go on then to one of the questions that we need to hear from in terms of what are the good practices and pathways that we would like to see scaled up to accelerate implementation of the environmental dimension of sustainable development, and you know, in the context of the Decade of Action. David, perhaps you would like to share your thoughts on this. I know you have shared quite a bit already in that area, but just to get the ball rolling, what are some of the good practices and pathways that you'd like to see scaled up in accelerating implementation towards sustainable development? And that would be for Dr. David Bino, please.
With reference to good practices, and I think that Barbados has a history of good practice with reference to seeking to involve civil society in policy development, but that can be improved significantly. And based on my presentation this morning, I would have made it very clear that civil society is at the heart of implementation. And I think one of the ways in which we can improve on this involvement and link it up to a larger global network is by actively pursuing the formation of UN major groups, representing farmers, representing women, children, these major groups that are not only present, that can be created at the national level, but then link to a global framework. Because once we do so, it allows us to reduce the level of policy misfits, or as Dr. Hines put it, policy schizophrenia. Because if we don't have the voices of local actors properly incorporated within policy, it's not going to be appropriate for the local level implementation. And that's why Erwin said, well, when he looks around, there's several policies there, but very few actually address the needs of the sector that he's trying to develop and harness. So I would posit this morning that we should look seriously again at the formation of major groups, look at those persons within civil society that are highly motivated, that represent those sectors, ensure that they are helped in terms of building the capacity that they need to implement, increase their awareness, which aligns to the same commission. And when we put them there, don't just put them there without having the appropriate resources, because they need the resources. The resources help to balance the power that I'm talking about. And then use that mechanism as an accountability mechanism to hold policy that was developed accountable. And we also hold them accountable at the same time. So I see that as an excellent example of a good practice that can be improved, that can be linked up to the global level, and then we can use that to accelerate policy implementation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who wants to add to those comments regarding what can we do to improve towards sustainable development?
I would like to see for us to place a lot more emphasis on the regional element of what we do. I do think that we do have regional platforms that are quite useful, but to focus on 166 square miles and to think that we're doing anything for the planet or for the region is very myopic. So I would want for us to, I mentioned, for instance, the sustainable tourism policy coming out of the CTO, which should address not just the part of the region that we are very comfortable with, the CARICOM members, but really the wider Caribbean. I would love to see a better approach to dealing with sustainability in this significant sector across the region, because dealing with, seas and oceans and just thinking about Barbados does not make sense within the context of the Caribbean Sea. And we also have some of these things that relate to sustainable and renewable alternative energy for the region. So I think we've made good starts in these areas, and I would love to see us expand on the regional element of what we are doing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christina. I'm going to, let me see, are there any other hands?
Donna,
Yes,
I'll just add to that a little bit. I've been
Winston.
focusing on the finance for the entire panel discussion, so I'll keep my focus on finance, because I think that is a really critical part of this transition as well. There's so many new financial products coming out in the era of greening that it's really important that we don't get left behind. So I've done some research on even the whole notion of green mutual funds, where financial companies invest in green companies and then sell those as a product to householders like you and me, and so that we then become involved in the stock market. And those sort of green mutual funds actually have a higher rate of return than just your regular mutual funds that you can buy from your broker. So there is some benefit for the consumer, and then those funds can be used to stimulate investment in sustainable development projects as well. So green mutual funds, even for example, the whole notion of green mortgages are actually on the table as well. Because if you think about buying a home that has retrofits to account for severe weather, retrofits that allow you to install green power, it therefore reduces the risk attached to that mortgage for the financial company. It also increases the income for the householder as well. So green mortgages are actually a really interesting new dimension that is coming into the market. And I just want to add one more from the sort of the company level, the whole notion of green securitization. So we normally use traditional assets to provide some type of asset to back a loan. So we might use a property, we might use our plant and equipment, but it's actually possible to now utilize renewable energy or investments in renewable energy to provide some type of security for your loan. So my roof space can be, say, utilized as an asset that I can lease to someone to provide some type of asset securitization to get a loan to invest in my business. So these are the types of new products that can be brought to the Barbados market and can be used to really stimulate investments in green industries in Barbados.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Winston. Erwin, I see that you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes, just to make a final point, in terms of things that we need to do, I think we need to minimize the amount of, as Christina put it, the schizophrenic policy that we have. You know, we see it with the drilling, we see it with our approach to tourism, but we need to, as Travis suggested, think through the whole process before we even put policies in place. Just recently in some new developments, we saw special provisions being made for people to import generators in Barbados. And generators run off two things, diesel or gasoline. And this is in the context of being fossil free by 2030 or 20, whatever number we end up with. So you have, again, schizophrenic competing policy. So I think we need to be really careful and think through it. Some are difficult to deal with. It's difficult to deal with the tourism issue that Christina brought up, but some things are not that difficult, especially when you've not put them out there as yet. So I think we just need to give these things some more thought and not be so reactionary when it comes to putting things in the public domain for consumption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erwin. Good point. Travis, I see that you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Sure. Yes, and thanks again, Madam Chair. I want to support the notion of the major groups. I think is David can't help but keep emphasizing it. I know they've started work back in 2013. But this is how it plays out. There are major groups at the international level that represent views on international policies. The Caribbean is never there. Small island states are never there. So any broader civil society perspective, you will see the North well organized, African major groups well organized, Latin America, Europe, but the small island region. So again, I really want to support that. And the idea that we need to put mechanisms in place to support, because this isn't being done for profit. This is being done in the interest of good governance. And I think from a social investment standpoint, I think it is in everyone's interest to ensure that these things work effectively. The other point, in terms of what other best practices, Christina mentioned the regional approach. And even as I think of the clean tech, I think that is how we have to imagine a clean tech industry, supporting Caribbean value chains in terms of making them cleaner, greener. What Export Barbados is doing needs to be scaled up. There's the Bloom Center, because if the business case is based on demand, And that is why these things thrive in the North. And we have a marketplace of what, 6 to 9 million persons. We think like that and try to push a new generation of businesses. I think that's important in terms of how we can improve the environmental sector, the environmental performance of the region, and ultimately better environmental governance. Last, I think some partnerships are critical. And as I reflect again, a conversation we had this morning with the head of environmental protection and some colleagues in UNEP, the monitoring of our environmental changes, it happens opportunistically sometimes. Coastal and others do things systematically, but the breadth of issues require technologies, and perhaps the clean tech sector here and University of the West Indies, beyond the policy, can sit down and think of what type of low-cost interventions that the environmental informatics, environmental monitoring space require, and get faculties to speak to each other. I've always said that the computer science department and the SERMIs, for instance, are they talking? Because we're talking about issues in one, we're putting graduates out there doing software programming, and that is where a lot of opportunity exists, the value exists. So I think we need to join these dots. And even as, again, I think of the climate projections that SERMIs is very good, is the business school looking at these projections? Because how will this shape the business world? So again, calling for partnerships, supporting and supporting the NGOs towards more inclusive governance forward.
Madam Chair, could I add something to that?
Sure, David, please go ahead. Thank you, Travis. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. For some reason, my camera is not, it's saying it's failed to start the video. So
that's okay.
What happened there? But I'll proceed with the audio until I get that sorted out. To make a very important point, I am not sure if those persons hearing my voice this morning understood when I presented those 4 factors to improve sustainable policy development implementation, that's a formula that is invaluable. And there was a presentation done by the World Economic Forum, and I know sometimes when people hear that name, they get a bit concerned for different reasons, but it was an excellent presentation with reference to being able to hack, excuse the phone there, hack the human mind. They said that human beings are now hackable in the sense that our behaviors can be predicted and unfortunately can be manipulated or swayed if we have the correct data. We have now reached the stage where we have computers that are powerful enough to be able to compute how we can change human behavior based on the data that we have. So I'm saying to you that we are concerned about policy implementation from a sustainable perspective. But if we look at those core factors that I spoke to you about, and we create enough data, and we're willing to go out there and not create a static policy, because we often create static policies. So we have the policy, we expect that the policy would implement itself, and then when we don't get the results, we're wondering why. We're supposed to have the policy, we go back there to the persons who we're targeting that policy to, and we get data, get feedback, find their motivation, find if there's the level of awareness is there, find if they have the necessary capacity and resources to actually implement these policies, and then look at the accountability. And if we do that and we have that data, we can tweak. If our policy is not static and is active and is adaptive policy, we can tweak it to ensure that we get the type of behavioral changes that we need to get successful implementation. And until we understand that that's how policy is supposed to be implemented, then we're not going to get the type of acceleration that we really need. And one final example to draw this point. We are trying to drive renewable energy in Barbados, but have we really gone out to these persons who have the resources to transform this sector, who want to, and to recognize that we have some serious issues in terms of approval, the speed of approval, and therefore there's a capacity issue not on the side of the private sector or civil society, but there's a capacity issue as it relates to government. And this is an easy capacity issue that can be addressed if we put the necessary resources there. But the returns, the dividends that will be paid from that small change would be significant, would be huge. So this is the type of adaptive management and tweaking policy that I'm talking about that is very practical to achieving the acceleration that we all want. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. I'm aware that Mark has to leave us, Mark Hill. And so at this stage, Mark, again, thank you very much for joining us. And if you don't mind, because we are running a little behind, but if you don't mind, please just give us maybe 30 seconds of your thoughts before you leave us regarding this topic and perhaps where you think we should be going, given that we're in the Stockholm.
Yeah, thanks, Donna.
Mark.
Yeah, thanks. So fundamentally, from where we sit is, business is business, and environmental activities have to make business sense if it's going to accelerate extremely fast. Well, so we know that because renewable energy is making significant business sense. You have anybody that ran a cost benefit analysis knows that solar pays back in 4 to 5 years with a current internal rate of return at 22% positive net present value. So that is what's driving the uptake of renewable energy, not because of the environment, but the environment benefits. So good environmental business, good business that is centered around environmental stuff is what we need to encourage more of. And to that extent, business models that centered around profitability as we mitigate against climate change is the route that we think that you need to make. Just want to speak a little bit to the offshore oil scenario, both Barbados and Guyana. At the end of the day, we're still talking about carbon neutrality, and the need for fossil fuel going forward as an export strategy is a central plank for us to continue to grow and maintain our quality of life, and also divert those resources into strengthening our environment as well. So we still need capital to drive not just growth, but to also maintain sustainability. So the purpose of still doing the offshore drilling is to have the capital, not just the time and the talent, to help maintain the whole sustainability narrative. And then lastly, what I would say is that we have to look at our consumption patterns as a community, and have a lot more education around sustainable consumption, especially in terms of imports. We're importing a lot of stuff. Some is harmful to the environment, but who's doing this? The merchants. Who's supporting it? Customers. So, and that demand is growing significantly every year. So we need to have in Barbados to have better price points for sustainable products. Because if we're going to have a bigger take by customer, price is important. So we need better price points for sustainable products going forward. So business is business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing these sorts of discussions, not only in this grouping, but beyond. We will certainly be in touch with you further along this process of Stockholm Plus 50. I do have a query as well.
Thanks.
Thank you. Go safely. I do have a query from Professor Patrick McConney, and perhaps Winston, you may want to address this. I suspect you might have done so in the chat, but I think for the purposes of our discussion, it would be good for everyone to hear these responses as well. Dr. McConney is asking, does the ease of doing business in Barbados facilitate green finance entrepreneurship now?
All right, thanks a lot.
One of the key things that really hinders finance in general is collateral. Commercial banks, finance companies, they have to ensure that whenever they lend funds to any potential entrepreneur or any potential business, that they can get back those funds for their investors. So as a result, one of what you tend to see in the Caribbean is that we have these really large collateral requirements, and it shows up in all of the doing business reports. So collateral requirements sometimes reach not only 100% of the loan, but sometimes the collateral requirements can reach up to 200% of the loan as well. So it's a significant challenge. So usually established businesses find it easy to get green loans because they can meet the collateral requirements, but we don't have a financial product as yet for startups in the area of green entrepreneurship. And that will be a new area that we'll need to consider. It already exists in some markets outside of Barbados, where you have finance targeting new businesses in the area of renewable energy, recycling, and startups in that area. But it's a new area that we'll have to get into.
Thanks very much for that response, Winston. Patrick, I hope that helps in terms of answering your question about new entrepreneurship in relation to green finance. So I'm going to pose another question, and then we're going to have a quick poll. But this question goes, it looks at what measures are needed to align public, private, and development finance with existing commitments and priorities. What measures are needed to align public, private, and development finance with existing commitments and priorities? I've also noted that Patrick McCaskey is with us today, but I will first broach one of our panelists on this, and anyone else who wants to join, please feel free. And okay, Winston.
Okay. I was waiting for other colleagues to jump in, but I'll jump in on this one.
Thank you.
One of the key things that we need to do first is to start with the gaps. So there are gaps that exist in many industries that if we're going to green those industries, we'll need finance to support those gaps. So say, for example, you're looking at transport, and you know that one of the key hurdles preventing you from getting towards that 100% renewable target is transitioning your transport fleet, because it's not possible for all of us to replace our cars with electric vehicles between now and 2030. It just isn't financially sustainable. So what are the steps that we can do to ensure that we can slowly transition between now and 2030? We can maybe incorporate other types of fuels into the mix. So all of us purchase gasoline from our gas stations. If you simply add biofuels to that gasoline mix, you immediately cut down on the amount of fossil fuels that you're using. Suppose you have, for example, 5% biofuel to fuel mix, you immediately reduce the fuel import bill for the island. So those type of transition steps, you can also consider hybrid vehicles as well as part of the transition. So it means identifying what are the transition paths towards your goal, what are the investment gaps that you need. And once you identify those targets, those objectives, then you can say, all right, I need to produce more biofuels. So this is the amount of financing that I will need to obtain, to support that transition in the area of biofuels. So I think it first starts with identifying the goals and the transition objectives. Once you have the goals and the transition objectives, then we can build some really great projects to meet our goals and our objectives, and also put in place the incentives to support them.
Thanks a lot for that response, Winston. I'm going to ask Patrick McCaskey, Director in the ministry, in the Economic Affairs Division, please, if he could respond to the same question, given that, there's quite a bit of planning that has to go into this, as well as the political alignment for addressing this particular question. Patrick, are you hearing me?
Yes, good morning.
Welcome back. Thanks for being here today.
Good afternoon. Now we think it's 12:02.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, because I was really taking a listening role, more being listening than contributing. But in terms of the question, if I understand it correctly, you're asking about, public and private financing relating to development financing. I don't think that is sufficiently well established here from my vantage point. It's an area that we would have to look at and develop going forward. I know there's financing out there. There's a weakness in my view with respect to the private sector being able to access, available funds. For example, being able to simply do a project proposal, and proposal writing is an area that, we would have to market and, educate the private sector, and not just the private sector, but those, I'm not talking about the large private sector, even the small in terms of the micro, at the micro level. And that's the area that I would, discuss with Mr. Hill in terms of getting, the micro, entrepreneurs to be able to write proposals, right? We had a number of courses over the years in proposal writing. So as to, I know that there's a financial literacy done in the Trust Fund Limited, for example, trying to educate persons how to, and I know that David Bynum, Mr. Bynum is well aware of it as well. So that is the area that we have to work and build on, and to let people know that there's money out there, development financing, but how to access it, how to get the private sector to access it. It has to be greater collaboration, between public, private, and so on to, access that, and we are working, in our development plan going forward to, fill these gaps. As I said yesterday, the bigger problem that I think that we have is, financing, access to financing and so on. And I recognize it's coming up today at this discussion. That's the area that we have to work on, because we are a resource scarce economy. And one of the biggest, gaps has to be the financial resources that we lack. And we have to build in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your response, Patrick. Okay, I've got another query for Dr. Christina Hines. You are going to be the target of this question. How do we transform governance and legal systems that maintain long-term economic stability and ecological and social well-being for all? Would you like me to restate?
Please.
Yes. Okay. How do we transform governance and legal systems that maintain long-term economic stability and ecological and social well-being for all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a huge question. I think that is part of the issue that we face, because, there is something larger that I really wanted to address, which is that, of course, we can all, and we should all, make changes as individuals to our patterns of consumption, how we live, all of these things. But we are doing this within a system that is not set up to address sustainable development, if I'm being honest. We are doing this within a system that I do not think is very well set up to deal with the power disparities, and the wealth disparities and so on that exist in our societies. And we really need to address this if we are going to deal with not just the environmental element of sustainable development, but sustainable development in general. So for me, and I have written a paper about this that maybe some people might not like, but I think that the biggest problem that we have with the sustainable development goals and sustainable development is that we are attempting to do all of these wonderful things in the face of a system that is built on capitalism, that really is about profits. So even Mr. St. Hill's response about why we need to continue this exploration and the ways in which we are going to focus on alternative energy because of it making sense from a financial position. I think this is a bigger part of the problem that we have. And we really do need to reimagine and reconstitute what it is we do and how we approach the economy, how we approach whatever it is that is development, who it is supposed to serve, how it is supposed to serve them, so that it is more people-centered and less, or there's more of a balance between people and the dollars and cents. Between the environment, we focus a lot today on a discussion of energy, but part of what we are supposed to be looking at is biodiversity as well. And we spent very little time on that because, you know, we are so caught up in ourselves and in the finance and the, you know, these elements that we've not focused on the other part of sustainability, the flora, the fauna, the wildlife, the turtles, the coral reefs. So this is a bigger question than a Barbados question as well. To me, we really need to think about not just what we do as individuals and what we do when we go to the polls, but the entire political system. And I would also say what we call the global political economy and the way in which it is structured around exploitation, so that you have billionaires and then you have people that are scrunting like many of us. I know that's not a good answer, but that's the best I could do.
Much appreciated, Dr. Christina. Point taken, and thank you very much for that. I'm just going to throw out another question to everyone present. And because a lot of what we are discussing has been bringing home the point that we need to have a level of integration that is required if we are really serious about sustainable development. And I know that we're running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up very shortly. I'm aiming for a wrap up at 12:15. But do you all believe that perhaps a National Commission on Sustainable Development would be merited in these times, as we are sort of, you know, trying again to push ahead with the acceleration of sustainable development? So the question again is, would a National Commission on Sustainable Development be merited in these times? And I can start with asking each panelist perhaps to respond. Thank you, Winston.
Thank you very much, Donna. This is such a really loaded question. I know we've had such panels in the past, and they've done really great work. But I really do think that we more need to integrate sustainable development into the panels or into the committees that we have now, because you're not going to move the agenda forward unless you have sustainability being discussed in the same meetings that you're discussing finance. You're not going to move sustainability forward if sustainability is not being discussed in those meetings where we're talking about taxation policy. So it's great to have a sustainable development commission so that you sort of pull all of the pieces together and you have a very consistent approach to this whole notion of sustainable development. But we also have to make sure that economists speak about sustainable development. We have to ensure that political scientists speak about sustainable development in everything that they are doing, so that we have it integrated in the policy path.
Thanks for that, Winston. But of course, I'm going to ask you again. So you talk about integrating it, but how exactly are we going to do that? how do we ensure that it actually happens?
It's basically part of the deliverables. So we have to have indicators for each of the committees. So if you are talking about a committee looking at taxation, what are the new tax policies that you're developing that would help finance sustainable development? If you're looking at transport policy, what are the areas that you are looking at that would help move us towards a more sustainable approach to transportation? So it will be embedded as part of the indicators or the outcomes of those committees.
And are you certain that we're not now going to be creating perhaps sustainable development silos within the context of each of the sectors, perhaps?
You're always going to have shortcomings of everything, but looking at in terms of the way in which we do things, maybe if I use my job here at the campus. One of the things that we're trying to do now is embed the whole notion of entrepreneurship in everything that we do and income generation. So when we have a meeting speaking about new courses that we're developing, we speak about how are we going to embed entrepreneurship in those courses. So even though there's an entrepreneurship committee driving the entrepreneurship goals here at the KFL campus, we still do embed those notions into everything that we do at the university level, the faculty level, the departmental level. And those are the type of things that I would like to see being done in relation to sustainability.
Thanks for that, Winston. David Bino, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, Madam Chair, excuse me again, my camera for some reason stopped working during the meeting. Yes, a Sustainable Development Commission. I think what Professor Moore is talking about there is mainstreaming sustainable development. That's an excellent idea. But with regards directly to the commission itself, I think there's room for a commission because the commission would allow for the revision process to take place, where you review what is there, and then you have an opportunity to impose or propose new policies that can improve upon what is there. So the life of the commission is something that would concern me, because I don't want this to be just a one-off thing for a year or 2 years and then it ends, right? So the idea is that sustainable development is an ongoing process. So we have a committee or commission there set up to constantly review our progress towards sustainable development and to propose those tweaks that are needed to accelerate sustainable development. So in that context, I think such a commission would be very appropriate.
Thanks a lot, David. Christina, what are your thoughts on a sustainable development commission?
I think it's a fairly good idea. As with all of these things, it would need to be appropriately resourced, and it would have to have, so when I say appropriately resourced, I don't just mean in terms of the dollars and cents, but also people having the ability to actually make a difference and to speak candidly on what is happening across the, every sector, every government ministry, agency, and what have you. And this is one of the issues that we face with these kinds of things. I would also combine it with what Professor Moore spoke about, which is, so it is not just the responsibility of this commission, but it would also be something that gets mainstreamed so that, so there's similar approaches we would like to see with gender as well, so that every single policy initiative that we are looking at, we ask particular questions. What are the environmental implications of this? Short term, medium term, what have you? How many, what is the level of resource use? What are the consequences on people from different class backgrounds, women, men, the disabled? All of these kinds of questions should be asked on a consistent basis across the board, so that it is not just this one entity, it is this entity that then would work in collaboration with every other government entity, agency, ministry, so that we do have this mainstreaming. So it should be quite interactive. And I would hope that, as I said, these things get created, but the problem tends to be that they're not properly resourced. And we just can kind of like tick a box and say that they have a group of frustrated people working on sustainable development. They're frustrated because they're doing good work, but their work is not making the kind of impact that is required.
Thanks very much, Christina. Erwin, just before I come to you with that question, I just wanted to note a comment from Patrick McConney, where he's saying that another NCSD could be useful if it was aimed at enabling action, learning, and adaptation, putting policies into practice rather than perpetual pursuit of policies on paper. Right, and Erwin, what are your thoughts then on having another National Commission on Sustainable Development?
Yes, thanks, Donna. I'm not opposed to it. My concern really is at the level of implementation. I've been in the private sector a long time, not even in mainstream corporate life, but I like operations that are centered around very specific targets and action points, so that in the monitoring process, we can say, okay, we've done 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's revise this now and add 8, 9, 10, and we monitor that closely and make our decisions based on data that has to be provided so that decisions can be making. I'm really not about developing a green, yellow, white, and orange paper to create then further 25 proposals, et cetera, I have had enough of that in my short life. And yes, I was already born in 1972, Travis. So I'm really about us having some very clear action plans, monitor that, and tick off and keep going. We've been meeting just to have meetings about meetings, and I'm really about, at this point, getting things done.
And Erwin, while I have you on the line, I think I'm going to start to ask that every panelist now that you just give 30 seconds of your thoughts, just as Mark would have done before he had to leave. Just 30 seconds regarding where we are and what your thoughts are now, having had this discussion. And before I come to you again, Erwin, I am seeing some comments regarding that question. I think Dr. Antrobus is saying only if government is committed to listen and taking proposals seriously. So there's a constant call for action. There's a call coming through to me for integration. These seem to be the things that we believe will help us to accelerate action, real action, and accelerate sustainable development in our region. So Erwin, please, your 30 seconds to wrap up. I really would appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, it's good that this comment came in at this point, because I believe that the way forward really is not to be put at the feet of government. I think it requires a full cross-sectoral approach from both public sector and private sector, including as many sectors as can be properly represented, because I believe that it will be a collaborative approach. It will need the input of all, and so we just need to work together to get it done.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Erwin. Christina, your closing comments, please.
Thank you very much for having me in this engaging discussion. For me, accelerating sustainable development for the next 10 years requires us to really ask the difficult questions and not just tinker around the margins, because that's not how we're going to deal with sustainable development. So we have to look at our core sectors. We have to look at the things that generate revenue in this country. We have to look at the issues that people face and ask some tough questions about how we really can advance an environmental and a sustainable agenda, rather than being overly obsessed with particular elements of this, such as the energy, which is useful, that generate revenue while not truly getting at the core of this and addressing things like the biodiversity and a lot of the income and other forms of inequality that can cause people not to be engaged and motivated to take part in this.
Thank you very much, Christina. Quite clear. David, your 30 seconds, please.
Yes. Accelerating sustainable development in the context of the decade of action must be a question of, and is an issue of implementation. And this implementation must be inclusive of all and not just some. We must ask ourselves, what does sustainable development look like for Barbados? It must be something contextual to us. What does it look like for us In doing so, we must ensure that power is balanced, that there are not some people who have a greater say than others, that they're resourced. If the example of the commission, if there's a commission, it must be properly resourced and have the power to make certain decisions that will impact policy. It must also look at where is the lack of motivation within the system in terms of actors. How can we motivate persons to ensure that this implementation meets their interests? Because once they can see their interests or what is it in it for me, they will act. Furthermore, we must ensure that those gaps of information and awareness are filled. And that's where public education across all sectors becomes very, very important. And finally, accountability. We cannot accelerate implementation or sustainable development if we're not accountable to what has already been done, so we can improve upon it in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And now I move to Winston for his closing comment.
Sure. I started by talking about finance, so I'm going to stay in my lane. I think we clearly need to accelerate the amount of investment that we're doing in the area of sustainability and greening in Barbados. We've come quite far. We're doing a great job. We already have our first green mutual fund. We have green loans for electric vehicles. So we're getting there. But I think in order to accelerate investment in green industries and green goods, we're going to need to accelerate the amount of financial products that we have in this area. So this requires the financial industry as well as the regulators to work together to help develop these products.
Great. Thank you very much, Winston. So I guess we also need to ensure that no one is left behind in the green transition, that vulnerable and at-risk groups need to be factored into the green finance solutions. We are hearing the call for having everyone at the table. We're hearing the call for having major groups considered as we move forward towards sustainable development. And I also like a comment that Dr. Androbus also said, everyone needs to be involved. And I think that is a very, very clear message coming from all of you today. So I think that's it, ladies and gentlemen. We are at the end of our process, at the end of today's conversation around Stockholm Plus 50. And all that's left for me to do now is to very, very quickly invite Senator Drakes to give us a closing remark, and then we'll move on. Thanks very much, Crystal.
Thank you, Donna. I just want to say a quick thank you to the panelists that joined us today. They did not disappoint. We've had 3 days of robust discussion, and I think what is really coming out of these dialogues is the need for transformational and systemic change. And what does that look like in actionable items? And I think the Stockholm Plus 50 process can be a space by which we bring the actors together to make sure that we have that change to actualize the change that we are looking for. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who participated. We will be having a validation exercise on May 9th. You can look out for that piece of information in your emails soon. I just want to say thank you, and it is raining heavily outside, so please be careful if you're going out. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon. God bless.
Okay. Thank you all again for being here, and please join us for the validation. We will announce it soon. Go safely. Yes, it is raining. There is actually thunder and lightning, so be very careful, everyone. Stay safe. Thanks again to our panelists and to everybody. Hearing you very, very soon. We'll be coming back to you. Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you. You too.
Thank you.